which then led to Carmelo Anthony saying, "Touch me and see what happens." At that point, allegedly, Austin Metcalf did get physical with Carmelo Anthony, at which point Carmelo stabbed Austin Metcalf one time in the heart.
You're watching the news unfold as the Carmelo Anthony situation takes an unexpected, and for many, uncomfortable turn. At the center of the controversy is not just the stabbing incident itself, but the way the family has chosen to respond publicly. You hear about a press conference held by Carmelo's mother, Kayla Hayes, who appears calm yet determined as she addresses the media. Her message, though framed around grief and the weight of public judgment, doesn't just ask for empathy. It subtly pushes a narrative that paints her son in a very different light than what many have come to believe. Then you find out they're selling T-shirts. Not just any shirts, but ones that label Carmelo as Carmelo the Hero. They're $25 a piece. It hits you like a wave. This isn't just about a legal defense or a plea for privacy. It's branding, it's merch, and it feels tone deaf. A kid is dead. Another is being defended not just legally but publicly and financially, all while social media explodes with hashtags like #FreeCarmelo and #Justice for Carmelo. It's not just confusing, it's unsettling. As you try to make sense of it all, you realize this situation is no longer just about what happened between two teens on a rainy day. It's now a case study in public perception, parental influence, and how easily a tragedy can be spun into a campaign. And even if you're withholding judgment, it's impossible to ignore how the optics look. Because while one family mourns a loss, the other is printing shirts. No matter which side you're on, you're left wondering, when did a criminal case involving a fatal stabbing become a brand strategy? And who benefits from rewriting the narrative this quickly, this publicly, and this profitably? You listen closer as Carmelo's mother continues speaking, laying out her family's story with emotion and purpose. She talks about moving to North Texas for a better life, about the hard work of her husband, and her role as a stay-at-home mom. You hear about love, nurturing, structure, and for a moment, it sounds like a speech any proud parent might give. But then something feels off, because behind the words about family values and chasing the American dream is the uncomfortable reality that her teenage son stabbed another kid in broad daylight. You start to ask yourself the same questions Asmongold asked. Where was that structure when her son was reportedly getting into fights at school? Where was the accountability when he got his hands on a knife? He's a minor. That means someone is responsible, and it's hard not to look at the parents. You begin to question how a tragedy like this could unfold without serious warning signs, and whether those signs were ignored. It becomes even harder to digest when you realize this isn't a story of an isolated moment of violence. According to classmates and reports, Carmelo had prior behavioral issues, so when his mother stands at a podium and speaks about being under attack, it feels like the focus is being pulled away from the root issue, the act of violence, the loss of life. You don't feel angry, just stuck in disbelief. Because while it's natural for a parent to defend their child, it's hard to hear that defense when it omits any acceptance of wrongdoing. It makes you wonder whether the focus is really justice or simply image control. And if the goal is to gain sympathy, it's not working the way they may have hoped, not when accountability is still nowhere in sight. You keep listening, and now the situation starts to feel even murkier. The family isn't just defending Carmelo, they're actively fundraising for him. You find out they've launched a GoFundMe for his legal defense. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are being raised to support a teen who, by all public accounts, stabbed another student in the chest. It's a bold move, and as you sit with that reality, the tone of the situation shifts again. This isn't just about mourning or even defending their son. It's about rallying behind him, financially and emotionally, in full public view. You don't even have to form an opinion to see why this is stirring backlash. People are angry, not necessarily because the family is grieving, but because of how they're choosing to respond. When tragedy strikes, families often go silent, focus inward, and let the legal process unfold. But this family has taken the opposite route, going public, setting up fundraisers, selling merch, and pushing a counter-narrative that portrays their son as a misunderstood hero. And as you process all this, you can't help but notice the key omission, the victim. There's little to no mention of the teen who died, no expression of sorrow for that loss, no shared grief, just defense and deflection. That silence is loud. You don't have to be a legal expert to understand why this feels wrong. The facts are still under investigation, but the public relations campaign is already in full swing. You realize it's not just the act that angers people, it's the optics. Because when you ask strangers to fund a defense for your child, while ignoring the one who can no longer speak for himself. You're not just defending your family, you're making a statement, and people hear it, whether you mean for them to or not. You begin to notice a pattern. As the mother speaks about her family being harassed, doxxed, and receiving death threats, it's clear that emotions are high on all sides. She describes how their home address and her husband's employer's information were shared online, forcing him to take a leave of absence. She paints a picture of a family now living in fear. And on a human level, you get it. No family wants to feel unsafe, especially when young children are involved. But then, you take a step back and look at the bigger picture. A young person was killed, not threatened, killed. And suddenly, you're struck by the contrast. The victim's family isn't on camera, isn't speaking at a podium, isn't raising money, they're grieving. Meanwhile, Carmelo's family is not only speaking out, but also using their platform to center the conversation around themselves, as if they're the ones who suffered the greatest loss. You don't condone the harassment. Asmongold doesn't either. He makes it clear that doxing and death threats are wrong, even toward controversial figures. He goes as far as to say there should be new laws to prevent mass public exposure of personal data. But he also reminds you that the scale of suffering here isn't equal. The mother talks about fear, but the other family is mourning a child who will never come home again. What's more unsettling is how generalized the mother's speech feels. She speaks of lies, misinformation, and being targeted, yet offers no specific examples. It starts to feel like a calculated way to shift the conversation from her son's actions to the fallout they're experiencing as a family. And while you can sympathize with their fear, it's hard to forget that this all started with a fatal act of violence, one that still hasn't been directly acknowledged. As the press conference continues, you hear the mother double down. She insists that claims about using fundraiser money to buy a new house or a luxury car are false. According to her, not a single dime has been touched, and even the platform hosting the fundraiser confirmed it. On the surface, this might seem like damage control, but it also raises a fair point. You start to realize that in the middle of this firestorm, there's also misinformation being weaponized. And in that moment, the outrage aimed at her becomes more complicated. You might not feel sympathy, but you do see the truth. If people online are inventing stories, saying she bought an Escalade or a house with donated money, and there's no proof of it, then they're muddying an already tragic situation. Asmongold admits this too. He doesn't side with the family, but he calls it straight. You can't lie on people just because they're in a controversial situation. That's not justice. That's internet hysteria. Still, the core issue hasn't changed. Even if she didn't misuse funds, even if the lies are just social media rumors, her son still stabbed someone. And instead of focusing on that fact, she's focused on public perception, how they're being targeted, how it's all been overwhelming, how it's affecting their mental health. You can't help but feel the tension here. On one hand, no one deserves to be falsely accused or harassed. On the other hand, the silence about the victim remains loud. There's still no acknowledgement of what the other family lost. The damage being done to her son's reputation is being highlighted, but the irreversible damage done to another young person's life is barely mentioned. And that's what sticks with you, how the conversation has been carefully steered away from accountability and into a spotlight of self-preservation. You're still listening, hoping at some point there will be a shift, some recognition of the life that was taken, but it never comes. Instead, you hear more about Carmelo's mental health, how it's deteriorating day by day, how the family is being discriminated against before a fair trial has even taken place. His mother says he's been raised in a two-parent household with structure, love, and faith. You're told they believe in the Constitution, the laws of the state, and fairness in the legal process. But none of that answers the question that everyone is silently asking. What about the kid who died? What about the parents who are planning a funeral instead of a legal defense? What about the community that's mourning, not the one defending? You notice how Carmelo's mother avoids using words like innocent or guilty. She doesn't explain what actually happened under the tent on that rainy and awful day. And legally, you understand why. Her lawyer likely advised her to avoid making direct claims about the incident, but it still feels hollow. The entire message is about protecting her son, yet there's no empathy extended toward the family left shattered by this event. You're left listening to a carefully worded, emotionally charged defense, but not once do you hear the word remorse. Then comes the kicker. She asks for continued support, patience, and prayers. And that's when it hits you. The narrative isn't just about defending Carmelo. It's about preserving the idea that this family has been wronged, that they are somehow equal victims in this story. but you can't forget the fact that someone is dead. And while the mother speaks of values and faith and due process, the silence around the victim screams louder than any of her words. Because at the end of the day, justice requires acknowledgement, and that still hasn't arrived. You wait for it, the moment where Carmelo's family might say something about the victim, a name, a message to the grieving parents, even a vague nod toward the tragedy, but it never comes, not a single word. And as the press conference ends, all you're left with is a carefully orchestrated performance that avoids the one truth no one can ignore. A teenager was killed. Asmongold picks up on it too. He points out what you've already felt in your gut. The absence of remorse is deafening. And while legally it might make sense to stay silent, morally, it leaves a sour taste. Because when you lead with, "Our son deserves justice," while skipping over the justice that's already been denied to another family, you alienate people. You strip the humanity from the situation and turn it into strategy. Then, as if to seal the deal, you see the shirts. Justice for Melo. Free Carmelo. Carmelo the hero. They're $25, cheaply printed, and plastered with a low-res design that's more embarrassing than inspiring. But it's not the design that gets to you, it's the message. They're selling T-shirts to support the image of a boy who killed someone. It doesn't matter if it was self-defense or something more. It hasn't even gone to trial yet. But the verdict, at least on social media, is being sold like merch at a concert. You can't help but shake your head. The family says they believe in the legal process, but from where you sit, it looks like they've already launched a PR campaign. And while it might win over a few, to most, it feels like a desperate attempt to rewrite the story before the truth even has a chance to speak. And you're left with one question: if the facts are strong, why the need to sell a narrative?